Hey everyone, and welcome back to Sweet's Musings, the series where I talk about the shows that mean a lot to me. And we're right back into Daria. Today's episode is Season 1, Episode 4, Cafe Dissafecto. Cafe Dissafecto originally aired on March 24th, 1997, and was written by Glenn Eichler. The basic summary is after the cyber cafe is robbed and subsequently closed, Mr. O'Neill sets out to create a classic coffee house with the students raising the funding for it. Daria refuses to fundraise and thus must read something on opening night. The key characters are Daria, Quinn, Jane, Mr. O'Neill, and Ms. Lee. This episode has a Daria Day intro. And like I said before, it opens with the cyber cafe alt.lawndale.com being burglarized, someone breaking in and stealing a computer. It then moves into Mr. O'Neill's class and begins with Mr. O'Neill talking, saying we're taking a break from the tragedy of Romeo and Juliet to the real life tragedy that happened just last night in Lawndale, speaking about the break-in at the cyber cafe. And he asks Kevin what he thought about it. And this begins a trope that it does not last very long of Mr. O'Neill not recognizing his students, calling Kevin Charles because he's looking at the wrong period seating chart. And this leads into my first quote from the episode, which is actually a Kevin quote. It just makes me chuckle each time. I was home all night. You can ask my parents. Besides, I already have a computer. It shows that, Kevin, he doesn't understand anything that goes on around him. He's not the brightest bulb. But it's a funny line nonetheless, and I particularly enjoy it. Mr. O'Neill moves on to ask Jody how she feels about it. And Jody gives a very articulate and well-thought-out answer. And Kevin tries to piggyback off of it. And then Mr. O'Neill asks Daria what she thinks, and he doesn't recognize her either. He misreads her name off the seating chart because of a spider crawling across. It calls her Dorian and not Daria. And Daria, she doesn't really care about the cyber cafe getting burglarized, And Mr. O'Neill misinterprets what she's saying as saying so, thinking she's talking about wanting, old school cafes where you watch some performers and share a cup with your friends and all that jazz. And so he says that would be a fabulous thing to set up, make a student cafe. And this leads into my next set of quotes. Right here, right now, let's pledge to make Daria's dream a reality, said by Mr. O'Neill, followed by Daria. You mean the one where people walking down the street burst into flames? And I kind of identify with that quote because haven't we all wanted pyrokinesis once in our lives? Haven't we all? So Daria goes home and Helen is pressuring her to get involved in some extracurricular activities. And Daria is just, she's not having it. She does not want to get involved. She is not one to get involved in anything. And Helen says, well, college is important. They look for that kind of thing. Daria's response is, they're actually going to be looking at whether or not I can pay for it. And Helen looks for help from Jake, who is oblivious and not much help. And eventually she arrives at, otherwise we're just going to have to make it up over the summer. Send you to music camp. And this gives us a little factoid about Daria. Because Jake says that's a great idea. Then asks Daria why she doesn't play her flute anymore. And Daria used to play the flute. And Jake ran over it when she was in the 5th grade, which is 2 years after she stopped playing anyway. That's just a little interesting fact, I think, that, Daria used to play the flute when she was in elementary school. Myself, personally, when I was in middle school, I played the clarinet. So it's just like, I actually really enjoyed it. I was not able to pursue it further than middle school because in my 8th grade year, I got a disease called Bell's palsy, which paralyzed half of my face. Now, if you know anything about the clarinet, it's a woodwind instrument, you kind of need to be able to pucker your lips and to play it. You kind of need to be able to close your mouth tightly around the mouthpiece to play. And I couldn't because half my mouth didn't work. I had no muscle control on that side of my face. So that for that entire school year, I basically played secretary to my band director. And after that, I stopped pursuing band, even though it was something I enjoyed. I wasn't very good at it, but I did enjoy it. But it was kind of hard to even fathom moving into high school band when I'd missed my entire 8th grade year of band. Anyway, that's enough of my past drama. So Daria goes to Mr. O'Neill and says she wants to work on the coffee house project. Mr. O'Neill is excited, thinking she wants to read something on opening night. She says she's not really into performing and would rather just do some fundraising, and then asks if she can go with Jane. And this transitions into Jane's house, where Jane is like not having it. She does not want to do anything like this. And Daria, tries to convince her. One thing I will say when we enter Jane's house is that every time we see Jane in her room, she is working on some new art piece. And I love it. I love her work in the show. I think I've said this before. I love her art. If it was real, I would have it. Like, if she was a real person and a real artist, I would have something of hers hanging in my house. I would put out the money to have a Jane Lane original. But anyway, this moves into how Daria is able to convince Jane. She says, do it for friendship. Jane says, no. Well, then do it for sisterhood. No. And this leads into my next quote. Then do it for the opportunity to look inside people's houses and find out what screwed up tastes they have. Jane's response, I'm bringing a Polaroid. That is such a Jane thing to say and such a Daria way to convince her. That is just such a them moment, and I love it. Honestly, what comes next in the episode, we see Brittany and Kevin out fundraising, and it is my favorite. It is my favorite scene in the episode. It is the best moment in the episode. Brittany is, saying, it's so smart of Kevin to wear his jersey, which I think is a funny line because the characters never change outfits. I mean, the fashion club does occasionally. I mean, they do occasionally change outfits, but it's like very rare, and Kevin hardly ever changes his. Like, I'll make mention when they change outfits, but it's like later seasons when that happens. Anyway, I just think it's a funny little line. And they end up walking up to this house, knocking on the door, and who is behind it? None other than Mr. DiMartino, who, as we know, I have said is one of my favorite characters. He is my favorite teacher. I absolutely love him. I think he's funny. I think he's great. Would I want him for an actual teacher? No. Is he a good comedic foil on the show? Yes. So they're trying to sell him wrapping paper, not having it. They try to sell him CD or cassettes, not having it. And he goes off on them. He not really goes off on them. He's just like, he pretty much intimidates them off his doorstep. But the last thing Kevin says is, want to buy a chocolate bar? Because that is such a Kevin thing to say. But I love Mr. DiMartino's reactions to them. Like, I wish I could recite it as well as I can recite other things from the show, but it's too good. I could not do it justice. It is the best moment in the episode when Kevin and Brittany try to sell Mr. DiMartino wrapping paper and shit. Now we get to see Daria and Jane on their fundraising. And they get to this house owned by Mrs. Johansson, I believe her name is. And when she opens the door, it is obvious she's quite the plus-sized woman. And she is very visibly out of breath. And when they say they're selling chocolate, she says, well, I like chocolate, but the doctor says we're not supposed to have too much of it. They ask if she's okay. She says, yeah, I was in the basement when the doorbell rang. Just have to catch my breath a little. But then she faints. She passes out while they're standing there. When she comes to, she says, damn hypoglycemia. And then tries to buy all their chocolate bars, which Daria and Jane refuse to sell her because she's hypoglycemic. She can't have the chocolate. It could possibly kill her. And the next day, Daria and Jane are called into Ms. Lee's office, and Ms. Lee is not happy because she got a call from Mrs. Johansson about 2 girls refusing to sell her chocolate. And this leads into my next quote, because Daria and Jane explain everything, and Ms. Lee is like trying to worm her way out of, this bad situation, because Ms. Lee, she's all about the money. She's all about the funding. It's just money, money, money. She doesn't really care about anything other than funding for the school and her own reputation. So Ms. Lee says, so your refusal to sell chocolate to this woman was based purely on concern for her welfare and not wanting to do time for manslaughter, is Daria's response. I like Daria's response to that. And Ms. Lee just, I understand the character. Doesn't mean I really have to like her. I don't like the, I guess because I've known people like her. She's very real. So it makes her uncomfortable at times. And Mr. O'Neill said, Ms. Lee says she cannot give Daria credit for working on the coffee house project. Mr. O'Neill says, well, why don't you read something on opening night? Daria starts to deny it. And due to Jane reminding her by humming Pop Goes the Weasel that she will be sent to music camp if she doesn't, she reluctantly agrees to read something on opening night. Real quick before I move on to the next scene, I forgot one quote from the scene before. When Daria says she doesn't want to do any more funding, she says, I believe in coffee for everyone, but I don't want to sell any more chocolate bars. It makes me feel dirty. Jane's response, the bad kind of dirty. I love that. I think it might be my favorite quote in the entire episode. Okay, on to the next scene. Daria is in her room going over her writing, and Jane is with her. And I love the title of her essays, short stories, you don't know which. I love them. I want to go over them real quick. The bleakness that lies ahead. No life, no hope, no future. And Mommy's Little Hypocrite. I love them. And Jane, turns all of them down, like saying, none of them really work for what's going to happen, for what is coming up, And Daria just reluctantly says, I'm going to have to write something new for the occasion. And she does, and we'll get to that in just one moment. Because at the coffee house, which is now open, we have just a few acts before hers. She is the last one going on of the night. We have a rock singer who is kind of grungy, kind of punk. Then we have Brittany and Kevin attempting the balcony scene in Romeo and Juliet. Brittany is giving it her all, and Kevin shows up with a skull, not understanding. He did not learn his lines. He's just there, and she is pissed at him. And then a character we don't see enough of, I think. I love her, the goth girl, Andrea. I just love her, and I love her poem. It is very fitting of her character, and it is very fitting of how I felt sometimes in high school. I'm here, but where are you? Sure, I see your body. anyone home in that rotting bag of flesh. I felt like that. I know that feel. And then Daria's story, which is about a character within the series. A series within the series is what I'm trying to say. I don't know why that was so difficult for me to come up with, but sometimes my mind just flakes. She's a spy, and it's all about her taking out communists and all that good old-fashioned spy stuff. And everybody loves it, except Mr. O'Neill, who was just like, he did not want something so graphic read on opening night. And after that, Cafe Lawndale is closed until further notice because the football team took things way too seriously and wanted to stone the Russian embassy. Of course, there are no embassies in Lawndale. I'm quoting what was written in the paper that Jake was reading the next morning. And the whole episode ends, it comes full circle with somebody breaking into the regular cafe, the coffee house, somebody breaking into the coffee house and stealing the espresso machine. Just everything comes full circle. Next up, my star rating. So overall, I would give Cafe Dissafecto 3.5 out of 5 stars. It's above average, but not by much. It is a very good episode. It's got some good moments. The Mr. DiMartino scene, like I mentioned earlier, is just perfection. I highly do recommend this episode. What? Anyway, that is my star rating for this episode, and I do highly recommend it. I hope you give it a shot. That was Season 1, Episode 4, Cafe Dissafecto. Next week, it will be Season 1, Episode 5, Mauled. I want to thank everyone for listening to Sweet's Musings. I hope you enjoy listening to it as much as I enjoyed recording it.